She raised her daughter to survive. She never imagined she'd have to survive her daughter, a forged signature, a stolen life. Now, at 69, Caroline Whitmore is rewriting the terms of inheritance, identity, and revenge. Some bonds break quietly. Others shatter loud enough to be heard in court. Caroline Whitmore moved the worn pen slowly, ink bleeding softly onto the faded page of her checkbook. At 69, her fingers trembled slightly. Arthritis whispered bitterly through the joints, a cruel companion that mocked her former ease. The kitchen around her, once vibrant with warmth and laughter, had grown colder, emptier, reflecting the stark reality she faced daily. The dim, flickering bulb above the dining table painted a pale circle on the worn oak, spotlighting a lifetime of subtle losses that now seemed overwhelming. Bills lay scattered around Caroline, unopened envelopes spilling their corners in quiet accusation. Each piece of mail felt heavier than the last, weighted by an unpaid urgency that made her chest tighten. She'd always been meticulous, a habit formed in her decades as a librarian, organizing shelves, cataloging volumes, gently correcting careless hands. But now her careful precision faltered against numbers that refused to balance. She adjusted her glasses, fingertips catching on a smudge that blurred the line of numbers she was trying to read. Caroline removed the frames gently, polishing them with the corner of her sleeve. The gesture was automatic, routine, yet tonight her movements felt mechanical, drained of their usual quiet grace. "You've become a financial burden, Mom." Delaney's voice rose unbidden, sharper and clearer with each repetition. Caroline flinched subtly, eyes closing as the phrase looped again, each word slicing deeper, carving out the remnants of dignity she struggled to maintain. Her daughter had spoken casually, offhandedly, unaware perhaps of the devastation contained in such few words. Delaney was not cruel, not intentionally, but carelessness sometimes cut deeper than intent. Caroline had prided herself on resilience. When James, her husband, had died 22 years ago, she'd swallowed grief quietly, arranging his funeral with a librarian's meticulous care, cataloging condolences as if they were valuable manuscripts that must be handled delicately. She'd shielded Delaney from hardship, taking extra shifts, stretching each paycheck, working tirelessly to ensure her daughter never felt the sharp pinch of poverty. Caroline's sacrifices had been silent, purposeful, a gentle martyrdom she had never regretted. Until now. Now, seated at this worn dining table in a cold kitchen, her meticulousness felt futile, a faded virtue unable to keep at bay the inevitable encroachment of debt. Her pension had shrunk alarmingly, costs rising beyond her careful management. The arithmetic mocked her efforts, numbers tumbling chaotically through her mind, spiraling beyond her control. Caroline felt shame rise hotly, spreading across her chest, blooming painfully beneath the surface of her carefully arranged composure. She opened her eyes, the dim kitchen returning sharply into focus. The dining table, once a centerpiece of joy, now seemed too large, dominating the room with an oppressive emptiness. She'd envisioned family gatherings filling this space, imagined grandchildren's laughter bouncing off walls warmed by memories. Instead, the room held only echoes of happier moments, of unspoken disappointments, and now of Delaney's thoughtless declaration. Her fingers moved again, pen hovering uncertainly above the checkbook. Caroline swallowed hard, throat tight with the bitter realization that she couldn't stretch her limited resources further. Delaney's words clawed insistently at the edges of her carefully built composure, pulling her back into a relentless replay. A financial burden. Caroline's internal monologue turned bitterly introspective. She had never burdened anyone before, had never been anything but quietly strong. Her shoulders had supported Delaney's dreams. Her careful planning had paved her daughter's path. Had she miscalculated somehow? Had she given too much, leaving too little for herself? The questions stung, whispered cruelly by her daughter's careless words, amplifying every uncertainty that Caroline had quietly buried over decades. Her gaze shifted toward a photograph propped against the kitchen windowsill, its edges yellowed with age. James smiling warmly, Delaney cradled happily in Caroline's younger arms. The image had always comforted her, evidence of a life filled with purpose. But tonight, the photograph felt distant, mocking her present loneliness, a painful reminder of the gap between past sacrifices and present neglect. She stood slowly, knees aching slightly as she moved toward the photograph. Picking it up gently, she traced James's smiling face, the curve of Delaney's infant cheek. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, defiant and rare. Caroline refused to let them fall, blinking rapidly as she replaced the photo. She would not succumb fully. Not yet. Not here, in this empty kitchen, beneath the unforgiving glow of the single dim bulb. Yet Delaney's words returned insistently, cutting deeper with each repetition. She wondered briefly if her daughter understood the gravity of what she had said. Delaney's voice had been casual, dismissive even, likely forgotten already, swept away by her busy, flourishing life. For Caroline, however, the phrase had lodged firmly in her chest, growing heavier with every silent repetition. She sank back into her chair, the worn upholstery groaning softly beneath her slight frame. Her gaze returned to the table, to the checkbook still lying open, half-finished calculations staring accusingly back at her. Caroline closed the book gently, its worn edges soft beneath her fingertips. Her meticulousness had served her well for decades, yet now it felt inadequate, unable to shield her from the harsh realities of aging, poverty, and familial neglect. She drew a quiet breath, composing herself carefully, restoring the dignity that Delaney's words had momentarily stripped away. Caroline's heartbreak was silent, deeply internal, never publicly visible. She'd learned long ago that showing vulnerability invited pity or worse, indifference. She refused both. Tonight, however, beneath this sparse glow, Caroline allowed herself a small surrender, a brief admission that hurt was real and that her meticulous planning had limitations. Tomorrow, she would rise again, balancing her careful calculations against the realities of dwindling resources. Tonight was simply a pause, an honest acknowledgement of wounds inflicted by careless words and economic strain. Caroline turned slowly toward the kitchen sink, fingers reaching automatically for the kettle. Tea might not erase Delaney's hurtful phrase nor change her precarious finances, but the routine itself held comfort, a ritual rooted deeply in survival and quiet dignity. As water flowed into the kettle, Caroline glanced briefly back at the pile of unopened bills, stark reminders awaiting her return. They would still be there tomorrow, quietly waiting. She'd face them again with the same meticulous courage she'd always summoned. Tonight, however, she allowed herself a moment of quiet grief, carefully contained, never fully expressed. The kettle hummed softly, the comforting sound soothing some small part of her tired heart. Caroline Whitmore would not collapse beneath the weight of Delaney's words, nor the brutal arithmetic of survival. She might be bruised, dignity shaken, but her strength lay precisely in these quiet, resilient moments. Delaney's voice echoed faintly once more, the painful phrase softened slightly by the routine noise of boiling water. Caroline allowed herself one final replay, feeling it sting, but not succumbing fully. Then, taking another steady breath, she turned toward the cupboard, reaching carefully for her tea. Tomorrow was inevitable, challenges awaiting her meticulous attention. Tonight, however, belonged briefly, entirely, to quiet heartbreak. Caroline Whitmore carefully set down the kettle, the warmth radiating gently through her trembling fingers, providing fragile, fleeting comfort in the stark solitude of her silent, weathered kitchen. The first time Caroline learned to measure love in dollars, she was only 8. Her father had towered over her, a stern man who believed emotions were best managed through financial discipline. Caroline had broken her mother's cherished porcelain vase, an accident swiftly followed by hot tears of guilt. Yet before she could fully confess, her father's hand silenced her sharply, palm raised to halt her childish remorse. "You've cost me enough today," he'd said coldly, counting out crisp bills from his wallet. Money was always his method. Payment was punishment. Guilt weighed against cost. Caroline had stood frozen, words tangled in her throat, silenced by the lesson that love carried a price tag, kindness measured out precisely in currency. Even now, decades later, she felt the imprint of his lesson as clearly as the sting of that first silencing. Today, Caroline saw echoes of her father's control reflected unsettlingly in Delaney. Her daughter, now 34, moved through life with calculating grace, every interaction precise, each word weighed carefully against potential gain. Delaney was meticulous, not in Caroline's gentle librarian way, but in a cold, calculated manner that polished her image to a flawless sheen. Delaney Whitmore Hayes had built her life around efficiency. Caroline often marveled at her daughter's crisp articulation, her carefully curated home, and the seamless way she balanced motherhood, marriage, and career. But beneath Delaney's polished exterior lay an unsettling rigidity, a coldness that occasionally surfaced in cutting comments, sharp eyes, and clipped phrases that echoed uncomfortably of her grandfather. Caroline had always believed this was Delaney's armor, a shield of ambition protecting her from vulnerability. After all, Delaney's career as a corporate strategist thrived precisely because she knew how to measure worth in cold, calculable terms. Delaney wielded influence, money, and power expertly. Yet Caroline often felt distant from the daughter she'd once cradled warmly in her arms. Delaney's husband, Carter Hayes, was the quiet shadow behind her gleaming facade, a passive figure whose ambition was primarily financial. Carter's presence was subtle yet purposeful, a man content to remain quietly supportive, provided Delaney's efficiency translated directly into increased prosperity. Caroline noticed how carefully Carter sidestepped disagreements, particularly when they involved Delaney's precise management of their finances. He was supportive, passively approving, but never intervening, his silence its own form of complicity. As Caroline's financial troubles deepened, she'd rationalized Delaney's coldness as stress. Her daughter's sharp remarks, those carefully disguised criticisms about money management, were surely just Delaney's own anxieties spilling over. Caroline, accustomed to forgiving minor cuts and bruises in familial relations, reminded herself repeatedly, Delaney carried burdens of her own, career pressures, societal expectations, motherhood. Surely this explained her harshness, her abrupt mannerisms. But tonight, Caroline felt something deeper shifting beneath this rationalization, something subtle but undeniable. She had discovered, almost accidentally, a disturbing new reality when she logged into her online banking. Her fingers had trembled slightly at first, a wave of panic washing through her chest as the words flashed cruelly on the screen. Login credentials invalid. Initially, Caroline had dismissed this as a technical glitch, yet after several increasingly frantic attempts, her fear solidified into certainty. A hurried call to the bank confirmed her growing dread. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore, your login was updated," the young customer service representative explained brightly, unaware of the dread pooling sharply in Caroline's stomach. "A new joint account has been opened for oversight purposes. Your daughter, Delaney Whitmore Hayes, authorized this earlier today." Caroline's breath caught sharply, the room spinning briefly. "Oversight?" she repeated weakly, gripping the phone as though it were a lifeline. "Yes, ma'am. Joint oversight, a common practice," the woman replied cheerfully, oblivious to Caroline's quiet panic. Common for whom? Caroline's mind screamed silently. Delaney had acted without her knowledge, quietly assuming control, justified undoubtedly in the language of efficiency and financial protection. But Caroline recognized this move with sudden clarity, the familiar echo of her father's cold voice in Delaney's carefully managed actions. Oversight. Financial surveillance masquerading as concern. She sat back in the worn kitchen chair, phone dangling uselessly in her hand. Her chest tightened painfully, Delaney's carefully calculated efficiency transforming into something darker, a quiet echo of patriarchal control Caroline thought she'd left behind in her childhood. The feeling of powerlessness crept forward. Again, a visceral reminder of silenced voices and transactional affection. Caroline's eyes fell to the table, catching sight of the unopened bills, now seemingly insignificant beside this deeper betrayal. Her father's harsh lessons resurfaced clearly, teaching her how subtly money could silence, could manipulate, could control. Had she unknowingly taught Delaney the same twisted lesson? She felt the tightening grip of shame, recognizing how deeply internalized misogyny had threaded through their family narrative, passed silently from father to daughter, and now onto the next generation. Caroline had believed herself immune, a victim rather than a participant. Yet somehow, her silence had allowed Delaney to grow into a woman who equated control with love, financial scrutiny with caretaking. As Caroline sat frozen, the phone buzzed softly again, an incoming text lighting the screen. Delaney's name appeared, her message precise and coldly reassuring. "Mom just wanted you to know. Made some updates to your accounts today for better oversight. We'll talk soon. Love, D. Carolyn stared numbly at the words. Love, such a casually weaponized term now, stripped of warmth and replaced by efficiency and control. Caroline realized with sudden clarity how deeply rooted Delaney's behavior was, how thoroughly she had absorbed their family's silent lessons in transactional love. Her first instinct was to reply, to argue, to reclaim some semblance of control. But decades of silencing lessons rose bitterly, catching her voice in her throat. She hesitated, fingers hovering uselessly over the screen, fear and anger mixing painfully with her habitual silence. Instead, Caroline carefully set the phone aside, drawing a shaky breath. A shift had begun, a painful recognition stirring beneath her rationalizations. She would no longer accept Delaney's actions as mere stress or misguided protection. This went deeper, a quiet brutality masked as efficiency, a legacy Caroline desperately wished to break. She rose slowly, her chair scraping quietly against the kitchen tiles. Caroline knew confrontation with Delaney would not be easy. It would challenge everything she'd accepted silently for decades. Yet tonight marked a turning point. Caroline's silence, the quiet currency she'd spent for years, had finally lost its value. She could no longer afford this quiet complicity, not at this steep, painful price. Delaney's text glowed steadily on the table, a beacon of her daughter's confident assumption of control. Caroline saw her clearly now, not as a victim of stress, nor merely ambitious, but as a product of generations of silenced women, enforcing patriarchal control in subtle yet devastating ways. She turned toward the sink, the familiar act of boiling water for tea, a small comfort against her fear. Tonight, Caroline Whitmore understood the economics of silence with painful clarity. It was a transaction she could no longer afford, a cycle she desperately needed to break, even if it meant confronting the cold efficiency her daughter had internalized so dangerously well. As the kettle warmed slowly, Caroline's resolve hardened quietly within her, each moment of silence clarifying the steep cost of her complicity. Tonight, she promised silently, marked the end of Delaney's oversight, the end of love measured by cold, cruel currency. Caroline sat quietly across from Mr. Hughes, the bank manager whose kind expression failed to soften the blow of his words. The room around her felt suffocatingly pristine, an office stripped of humanity and warmth, sterile furniture arranged with stark efficiency, papers laid out on the polished surface between them. Caroline kept her hands folded tightly, fingertips white from the silent, hidden panic pulsing steadily through her veins. "I'm afraid it's quite clear, Mrs. Whitmore," Mr. Hughes said gently, his voice measured but firm. "Your daughter Delaney has full joint ownership. These documents show your consent." Caroline stared blankly at the paperwork laid carefully before her, neatly typed pages mocking her confusion. Her signature was precise, convincingly rendered, yet wholly alien, an immaculate forgery. She swallowed, forcing the rising panic down behind a carefully maintained facade. "I never signed these," she whispered, voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. She felt small, brittle, trapped inside a cage of paper and ink, her autonomy neatly stripped away by her daughter's precise hand. Mr. Hughes cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Whitmore, the signatures were notarized. Perhaps you've forgotten." The gentle accusation hung in the air, a silken cruelty masked as kindness. Caroline's throat tightened painfully, her dignity battered silently beneath the implication. Forgotten, another subtle reminder of her age, her vulnerability, her declining worth. She met his gaze squarely, refusing to let humiliation spill openly into the stark office. "Can I see the safe deposit box, please?" Caroline finally asked, her voice carefully steady, hiding the tremor beneath a practiced veneer of composure. "Certainly," Mr. Hughes replied softly, his discomfort apparent in the hesitation of his movements. He stood, guiding her toward the bank's inner sanctum, the hallway starkly quiet, echoing with each precise footstep. When the door swung open, Caroline felt her heart sink deeper into panic. The safe deposit box, a small fortress that once held her most personal treasures, was empty, stark metal mocking her from its shadowed interior. Nothing remained. No jewelry, no photographs, no carefully folded documents saved meticulously over decades. Emptiness confronted her coldly, reflecting the hollowness she felt within. Everything's been removed, Caroline whispered, barely audible even to herself. Mr. Hughes adjusted his glasses awkwardly, words cautious, sympathetic. Your daughter took charge of the contents, Mrs. Whitmore. Again, she had your documented approval. Caroline nodded numbly, feeling herself retreat inward, her calm exterior masking a swiftly spreading dread. The quiet control Delaney had wielded with such apparent ease now felt ruthless, cold, and complete. Caroline's name was erased, methodically stripped from autopay records, her autonomy taken piece by piece, silent but absolute. Stepping slowly from the bank, Caroline's mind blurred into memories. She remembered herself young, a new mother carefully hiding coins, her own small rebellion, from her husband's tightly controlled weekly allowance. Each hidden penny felt quietly defiant, a secret strength against her husband's financial oversight. But this was different, darker, a reversal more crushing because it came from her daughter, masked as efficiency, packaged neatly as concern. She drove to Delaney's home, heart pounding with restrained panic that barely held itself within the careful confines of her composure. She needed answers, clarity, some truth amid the cruel confusion. But when Delaney's door opened, Carter stood awkwardly before her, his expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and apology. "Carter," Caroline began slowly, voice carefully controlled despite the trembling inside her. "I need to understand what's happening. Delaney's made changes. I didn't authorize any of this." Carter shifted nervously, his gaze avoiding hers. His passivity, so often a silent acceptance of Delaney's control, now felt actively complicit. Caroline felt anger flicker sharply beneath her carefully held panic, the emotions swirling fiercely beneath a tight veneer. "Carter," she repeated more sharply, commanding his wavering attention. "Did you know about this?" He stammered briefly, words slipping clumsily from his lips. Delaney just wants to keep everything in order, Caroline. She thinks this will be better, safer for you." "Safer?" Caroline echoed incredulously, her carefully restrained panic breaking slightly through her voice. "She forged my signature, Carter. My safe deposit box is empty. How is that safer?" He hesitated, visibly uncomfortable beneath her steady gaze, guilt flashing briefly before he regained his faltering composure. "It's for your own good," he finally muttered weakly, eyes darting sideways, avoiding her direct confrontation. Caroline's chest tightened painfully, her restraint wavering dangerously close to breaking. "My own good? Carter, she's taken everything. She controls everything. She thinks—" he began uncertainly. "Well, it's about keeping track, protecting you from mistakes. Finances can be complicated at your age." "At my age," Caroline interrupted sharply, the words bitter on her tongue. "You think I need protection from myself?" Carter's silence was answer enough, and Caroline felt her anger dissolve slowly into sadness, a painful acknowledgement of his quiet complicity in Delaney's cruelty. She steadied herself, breathing carefully to hold panic firmly in check, refusing to let him see just how deeply this betrayal had cut. "You don't even see how wrong this is?" Caroline said finally, voice tight with restraint, anger flickering faintly beneath carefully controlled panic. "You've both trapped me in a cage of paperwork and protection. Did you ever stop to consider that your good intentions were suffocating?" Carter remained silent, shifting uncomfortably, guilt spreading visibly across his expression. His passivity had always been a quiet force, supporting Delaney's control, but now Caroline saw clearly how dangerous silence could become, how devastatingly cruel a lack of resistance truly was. "I trusted you," she continued quietly, words trembling slightly despite her efforts at composure. "Both of you. Now I don't know who you are." Caroline turned slowly, stepping carefully away from the house she once saw as safe, orderly, efficient. She felt the chill of realization settling deeply into her bones, the recognition of betrayal masked in tidy paperwork, control hidden behind carefully constructed rationalizations. As Caroline drove slowly away, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, she fought desperately against the overwhelming surge of panic threatening to consume her. Each careful breath, each measured exhale anchored her fragile control. Delaney's betrayal felt complete, methodically stripping away Caroline's autonomy under the pretense of care. The car windows blurred with silent tears she refused to let fall. She knew now that the paper cage constructed around her wasn't just financial, it was deeply emotional, bound up in twisted notions of control, power, and protection. Delaney had become the guardian her father had once been, money the leash that kept Caroline obedient, silent, and subdued. Yet within that carefully controlled panic, Caroline felt the first faint glimmers of defiance stirring. If her daughter believed control could be wielded through documents and signatures, Caroline would find her own quiet strength, something beyond the reach of paper cages or forged signatures. Tonight, she would allow herself the pain of betrayal, the panic restrained but raw beneath the surface. Tomorrow, she promised herself silently, she would find a way to fight, quietly, fiercely, reclaiming a life Delaney had tried so ruthlessly, so silently, to cage. Caroline sat at her small kitchen table, hands cupped around a warm mug, staring numbly at a faded photograph. The image captured Delaney at 7, smiling brightly, her wide blue eyes sparkling with curiosity, intelligence, and a tenderness Caroline had nearly forgotten. Back then, Delaney had clung to Caroline's every word, a small hand curled securely within her own. Caroline remembered bedtime stories whispered softly, endless questions patiently answered, love given unconditionally, even as their world slowly frayed at the seams. But Caroline also remembered the subtle shift, the slow transformation of her daughter's bright innocence into something harder, colder. Survival instincts sharpened early by necessity. Caroline's struggle to keep their small family afloat had been relentless. Each month, a quiet battle waged against scarcity, insecurity masked by calm assurances whispered nightly to Delaney. Yet children always sense more than parents intend, their hearts shaped silently by fears unspoken. She gently traced her daughter's face in the photograph, wondering bitterly whether her efforts at strength had unwittingly hardened Delaney's heart, replacing tenderness with calculation, vulnerability with ruthlessness. Did I raise her wrong? Or did I raise her real? Caroline whispered aloud, the question heavy with regret, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The emotional wound gaped wide, raw and unhealed, carrying the haunting uncertainty of motherhood's greatest fear, failure masked as survival. Her phone buzzed quietly on the table, pulling Caroline's attention from her painful reverie. A Facebook notification flashed, Sherry Monroe sent you a friend request. Caroline's heart jumped slightly, a gentle surprise rising through her lingering melancholy. Sherry had been Caroline's closest childhood friend, someone who had faded gradually with the years, lost to distance and quiet resignation. Now, her sudden reappearance felt both comforting and oddly serendipitous. Caroline tapped gently, accepting Sherry's request, her smile faint but genuine, welcoming the familiar warmth of a connection from simpler days. Minutes later, Sherry's message appeared, bright, immediate. Caroline Whitmore, found you at last. How have you been? A smile softened Caroline's expression, though her reply came carefully measured. Managing as best I can. Life's had its complications. Sherry's response came instantly, empathetically keen. Don't I know it? Coffee soon? I'd love that, Caroline replied, heart fluttering with tentative relief at reconnecting with someone who'd known her before survival had hardened both her heart and her daughter's. Yet the relief quickly faded, replaced by the sinking reminder of the delicate reality she now inhabited. Caroline's world had narrowed dangerously, constrained by her daughter's financial oversight, her autonomy eroded methodically, leaving behind only hushed anxieties and relentless fears. With quiet resolve, Caroline stood, reaching for a worn notebook tucked carefully beneath a stack of mail on the counter. It had become her silent companion, a private space to document each quiet encroachment. Every transaction moved silently from her control to Delaney's vigilant oversight. Caroline's pen had become a quiet rebellion, a means of preserving truth in a world increasingly shaped by Delaney's narratives of efficiency and protection. Tonight the notebook became something else, a journal of reflection and introspection, tracing the lineage of generational wounds from her father through herself and now into her daughter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wrote, carefully framing the question she feared most deeply. How had sacrifice transformed into weakness? When had survival blurred into ruthlessness, love reshaped cruelly into control? A soft ping interrupted Caroline's thoughts, a quiet, intrusive reminder of the smartphone she'd nearly forgotten beside her notebook. The screen flashed briefly with a voicemail notification, a call she'd missed earlier, the number unknown. Curiosity mingled with mild unease, and she tapped the message, listening quietly as an unfamiliar voice filled the silence. Laughter rippled first, sharp and bright, quickly identifiable as Delaney's voice, her tone casual, harshly amused as she spoke to someone Caroline didn't recognize. Honestly, I don't even know why I bother pretending. She's like a dumb old credit card with a pulse, swipe when needed, discard when useless. Caroline felt the words land painfully, her chest tightening sharply, breath catching in a brief gasp of disbelief. Her daughter's voice continued lightly, amusement twisting darker beneath careless laughter. Maybe she'll catch on eventually, but I doubt it. She's too busy acting dignified. But it doesn't matter, right? She can't really do anything now. Caroline's hand shook visibly, the phone slipping from her fingers, landing softly on the table's surface. Her heartbeat pounded, loudly echoing the cruel, mocking words, Delaney's laughter haunting her like a bitter ghost, the ultimate confirmation of her deepest fears. Did I raise her wrong? Or did I raise her real? Her daughter's careless cruelty made clear the generational wound Caroline herself had inherited and silently passed down, sacrifice twisted into weakness, strength hardened cruelly into control. Delaney, shaped by Caroline's own desperate survival, now stood as both victim and perpetrator of an inherited trauma. Caroline felt anger rise sharply within her, edged with grief, guilt, and a profound, aching sadness. She had tried, so fiercely, to protect Delaney from hardship, to shield her from scarcity's relentless bite. Yet somehow, in her desperate bid for strength, Caroline had silently reinforced a cycle of ruthless survival, teaching Delaney to equate love with leverage, care with calculated control. She picked up the phone again, pressing replay, forcing herself to listen again, absorbing fully the depth of betrayal. Delaney's mocking laughter echoed coldly, a painful validation of the realities Caroline had been quietly denying. Yet beneath the sharp sting of betrayal, Caroline sensed a shift. Her daughter's cruel laughter had inadvertently freed something within her, shattering the last fragile illusion that Delaney's behavior was merely misguided care. Caroline felt a resolve solidifying quietly, rooted deeply in recognition, acceptance, and painful clarity. She picked up her pen again, her fingers steadier now, determined, words flowing deliberately onto the page, precise documentation of each betrayal and oversight. Her notebook became a record of truth, an anchor amid chaos, a quiet reclamation of autonomy against Delaney's calculated control. Each sentence affirmed quietly, fiercely, that Caroline Whitmore was neither a credit card nor a pulse to discard carelessly. She was a mother who had loved imperfectly but fiercely, whose intentions had always been guided by survival, sacrifice, and genuine, if sometimes misguided, love. The past could not be rewritten, Caroline acknowledged silently, but perhaps the future could be reshaped by quiet courage, honest reflection, and careful confrontation of the generational wounds now painfully exposed. With quiet determination, Caroline closed her notebook, the voicemail safely preserved as undeniable proof, evidence quietly stored. She rose carefully, reaching once more toward the photograph of Delaney as a child, smiling softly, tenderly, eyes holding secrets that Caroline now understood more deeply. Generational trauma might have shaped them both, but Caroline resolved silently, fiercely, that it would no longer define her. Her daughter's laughter, cruel though it was, had awakened something long dormant, a strength buried beneath decades of silence and sacrifice. Tonight marked a turning point, love reclaimed from silence, survival redefined beyond cruelty. Caroline Whitmore knew she could not rewrite history, but perhaps she could still alter its future, for herself and even for Delaney. Caroline sat in the worn leather chair across from Howard Brenner, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The office was unremarkable. Gray carpet, tall filing cabinets, a single window that looked out onto a parking lot bordered by skeletal trees. But Howard himself was exactly as she had hoped. Quiet, sharp, and, most importantly, thorough. He wore wire-framed glasses and the faintest air of skepticism, not of her, but of the world at large. Caroline found it oddly comforting. He skimmed the documents she'd brought, old wills, pension information, notes scribbled meticulously in her tiny, precise handwriting. She had come prepared. Weeks of quiet planning, countless late nights hunched over bank statements and browser tabs had led her to this sterile room. No joint ownership? Howard asked without looking up. Not anymore, she replied. Her voice was calm, her words clipped. We dissolved that first. He nodded. We'll set up a new account. Independent, password protected. Delaney won't see a cent unless you say so. Caroline exhaled slowly. Relief didn't flood her. It leaked out in steady drops, too cautious to come all at once. She watched Howard make careful notes, his pen scratching with unhurried certainty. Each stroke felt like a reclamation, another tiny withdrawal, not of money but of herself, from Delaney's quiet tyranny. It wasn't revenge. Caroline had repeated that to herself every day since the voicemail, since Delaney's laughter branded her like a cattle mark. This was something else, something quieter, a reassertion of identity, of presence, of the right to remain. Howard looked up. And the will? New, she said. Very new. I want every clause airtight. He gave her a small smile. I do airtight. As he drafted the paperwork, Caroline reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out a narrow, spiral-bound notebook, its cover a soft charcoal gray, no title. She held it for a moment before tucking it gently back inside. It had become her second skin, this burner journal. Not a diary, not a log, something else. She wrote in it every night, long after the house had gone silent. Not for justice, not even for proof, just for clarity. Truth lived there, in the mess of memories, confessions, contradictions. It was the only place left where Caroline didn't feel like she had to perform strength. It asked nothing of her but honesty. This isn't about revenge, she said aloud, more to herself than Howard. He paused his writing and looked up again. It's about not being erased. Howard studied her quietly for a moment, then nodded. That's as good a reason as any. The paperwork continued. Caroline signed deliberately, her pen steady. The quiet ritual of it was calming, each signature an act of reclamation, a counterweight to the months of silent diminishment. She could still feel Delaney's voice curled in the back of her mind, cruel and laughing, like a dumb old credit card with a pulse. But it no longer held the same power. Words had edges, yes, but they could also be dulled. That evening, she found herself sitting at one of the public library's terminal stations, the screen casting a faint glow across her face. She'd chosen this place deliberately. Here, beneath rows of fluorescent lights and the soft rustle of pages, she had once built a career, a life. Her hands knew this desk. Her back remembered this chair. It was a kind of coming home. The online banking interface blinked softly on the screen. She typed slowly, deliberately, two-factor authentication, redirected security questions. A silent trust, freshly named and newly private, now waited for its first deposit. She clicked, transfer. The amount was modest, but it moved like a secret, swift and quiet. Money that would never show up on Delaney's carefully curated oversight spreadsheets. Caroline's name had been too easily erased once. Now it would live again, in lines of code she alone controlled. Around her, the library remained still. A few students typed noisily a few rows away, but no one looked in her direction. She was invisible here in the best possible way, free from scrutiny, free to act without being questioned, guided only by her own calm urgency. After the transfer, she logged out and slipped a note card into her burner journal, marking the amount and the date. She paused, then flipped to a fresh page. Today I moved the first piece of myself back into my own hands. It felt like breathing. She closed the journal and held it against her chest for a moment. Each entry had grown more assertive, more deliberate. She had started by writing letters to herself, small reminders of who she had once been. Then came the stories, memories of Delaney as a toddler, her laughter pure and sharp, her little hands always reaching for more. Then the harder truths, the decisions made from fear, the times she'd chosen silence over resistance, the subtle ways she'd modeled resilience as passivity. And then the voicemail. She had transcribed it word for word on page 73. Now page 86 marked the shift. She stepped out of the library into the cool dusk. The air smelled like rain but held back, uncertain. She walked slowly to her car, the burner journal pressed firmly under one arm, the scent of old books still faint on her sleeve. Each step felt different now, no longer tentative, no longer resigned. Howard would finish the paperwork by Friday. By then, the new account would be operational. She'd move what she could when she could. Delaney might never notice, at least not immediately. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Caroline Whitmore was not a relic to be managed, not an inconvenience to be budgeted, and certainly not an account to be closed. She was a woman with a voice, a memory, and finally, a strategy. Back at home, she sat quietly on the edge of her bed, the journal open again in her lap. "This is what survival looks like when silence fails," she wrote. Not loud, not vengeful, just sharp, just enough. She underlined enough 3 times, then closed the book, slid it beneath the drawer liner in her bedside table, and exhaled. This wasn't revenge. This was what came after the betrayal, after the ache of the erasure, after the slow unraveling of everything familiar. This was the part where she wrote herself back in. Caroline's footsteps echoed softly in the early morning hush as she moved from room to room, each step gentle but deliberate. The house felt cavernous, walls lined with decades of accumulated property, yet brimming with stories she never told out loud. It was as though she had built a museum of voicelessness, every object curated to preserve silent sacrifices and unspoken grief. She stopped first in the living room. On a side table sat the silver tea set she and James had selected together on their 10th anniversary. Caroline picked up the creamer, fingers brushing faded monograms. Memories surfaced, afternoons steeped in warm conversation, her voice unhesitating, nothing clipped or cautious. But later, roles shifted. Her voice receded, overtaken by children's demands, by job responsibilities, by a marriage where her own aspirations were quietly sidelined. With a quiet resolve, she placed the creamer in a cardboard box labeled Sherry, careful. She would pack each item as though preparing an archaeological exhibit, artifacts speaking for themselves in absence of her any more unspoken words. In the kitchen, she paused over the chipped mixing bowl she used for every birthday cake she baked. Its glazed surface bore the texture of her careful generosity. She pressed the bowl against her cheek for a moment, tasting memory, before nestling it among the other heirlooms. Down the hall, Caroline passed framed certificates from her years as a librarian. Overlooked promotions hidden behind polite rejection letters she kept folded in desk drawers. She'd never displayed them, their margins frayed from being pushed aside in favor of more immediate family needs. Now she placed them into the box, each credentialing success a testament to passion buried beneath duty. Her pace remained steady, haunted by flashbacks. She recalled the night she finished library school, James's proud grin lit by the hallway lamp. Yet when the promotion came years later, she'd been passed over for a younger, less experienced candidate. She'd accepted the decision with grace, swallowing disappointment, never voicing the injustice. She didn't want conflict, to preserve peace. But peace had only built walls around her silence. She moved next into her old bedroom, its wallpaper faded, the carpet threadbare. On the dresser sat her mother's locket, gold and delicate, engraved inside with the date of her wedding to Caroline's father. Caroline opened it, inhaling a rush of remembered stories, her mother's soft voice, the careful caution in her eyes whenever money was mentioned. Fear lived in that locket, the same tremor Caroline felt when remembering her father's control, but also love, fragile and tenacious. She closed the locket and placed it gently in the box. The artifact of her mother's restrained courage would travel silently to Sherry, who had known both women. Each boxed item carried not only memory, but emotion, anger deferred, pride subdued, fear veiled in caretaking. In the den, Caroline encountered the thick hardcover volumes she'd annotated for decades, literature that informed her identity, even as she prioritized other people's voices over her own. She wrapped the books with care, secluding her intellectual self from the museum of her own voicelessness. When the final box was taped shut, Caroline carried them carefully to her car, stacking them methodically. Each box felt like a coffin for parts of herself she had long forgotten. She drove to Sherry's house, surprising herself when Sherry came out to the porch with a soft smile and tear-filled eyes. Wordlessly, Caroline opened her trunk, and Sherry began carrying box after box inside, each item discovered with quiet wonder. They did not speak much. Words felt too loud, too raw. Instead, their silence conveyed everything: reclamation, grief, restitution. Back home, Caroline paused at the hallway mirror. The face reflected back startled her. Her shoulders were straighter now, more deliberate. Her eyes held something sharper, quiet determination, a glint she hadn't seen there for months. The Caroline in the mirror, once defined by compliance, now appeared accountable to her own self. She realized she didn't quite recognize who she had become for others: pliant, unseen, background, or who she was now. Someone reclaiming her story, piece by piece. Her gaze lingered, searching, steadied by resolve. She whispered softly, as though confessing something to an ally. "I'm still here." The mirror's reflection rippled back, unwavering. Later that afternoon, Caroline sat at the kitchen table, the last of her unwavering calm fading behind an edge of tension. She picked up the phone and dialed the travel agent's number, her voice crisp and formal when they answered. "Hello, this is Caroline Whitmore," she began. "I want to inquire about a single-room retreat, somewhere with privacy, yes, and sea views." In September she paused, pen poised over a small notebook heaped with itinerary notes. "I need time away." "Yes, ma'am. I can recommend a few options," the agent replied, obliging. Caroline scribbled addresses, dates, pricing. She pictured her own suitcase, no longer weighed down by others' expectations. She would travel. She would begin again. As sunlight faded, she collected the day's mail. A notification from her new account popped up. A balance that only she could access. A flicker of satisfaction passed through her, warming more subtly than the afternoon sun. She carried the letter from the mortgage company with trembling hands. She'd almost expected it, but the confirmation hit her nonetheless. "Second mortgage recorded in your name." The debt burden was significant. Delaney had taken out a second mortgage without consulting her, was arranging to strip even more autonomy through debt. It was the final blow. Caroline let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The emotional stakes had escalated dangerously. Delaney's control had gone beyond paperwork and funds, now deeper into her home, her property, her legacy. It was silent violation, a mortgage unspoken, but its weight pressed against her spine with finality. She sank into her chair, eyes fixed on the mortgage statement, a calculated intruder within the museum of her life. Restrained panic flickered behind her calm exterior. But Caroline had reclaimed her voice. She felt it rising, coolly measured, unwavering, inviolable. Tonight, she would record the discovery in her burner journal. No dramatic flourish, just fact. Then tomorrow, she would call Howard, and the travel agent, and anyone necessary. The next steps would be laid, deliberate. She rose, walked back to the mirror. She looked again at the face reflected there, women's faces layered in the glass, her mother's caution, her own history, her daughter's unspoken caution, her newfound resolve. She saw not a broken woman, but a woman actively reclaiming, unpacking her own museum of unspoken things, resolutely, quietly, without apology. And as dusk deepened beyond the window, Caroline Whitmore turned away from the silent artifacts of her past and toward a future she would define for herself. Caroline waited on the front steps of Delaney's home, the sun already dipping behind the hedges. Evening shadows stretched long across the concrete, and in the stillness, she could hear the faint hum of sprinklers from a neighbor's yard. She sat perfectly still, her purse clutched loosely at her side, not as armor, but as ritual. She hadn't come with papers, or documents, or threats. She had come with her voice. Delaney opened the door a few minutes later, still in her blazer, holding a tablet in one hand and a cordless phone in the other. She blinked at the sight of Caroline, momentarily off script. "Mom," she said, uncertain. "What are you? Did we have something planned?" "No," Caroline answered. Her voice was low but steady. "But we need to talk." Delaney hesitated before stepping aside. "Of course. But I only have about 15 minutes. Carter's stuck at the office, and I've got Miles's school committee thing in an hour." Caroline walked into the foyer, the air inside sharp with the scent of eucalyptus and staged cleanliness. Everything gleamed: tables, floors, the silver trim on the mantel. Delaney led her to the dining room, a pristine arrangement of cold modernism. Nothing on the table but a single decorative bowl. They sat across from each other. Caroline waited for Delaney to put down the tablet. She didn't. "So? Delaney prompted, swiping at her screen. Is this about the doctor appointment? I already rescheduled it for you. Or the bank stuff. You've seen the balances. I've made everything way more efficient. Caroline's gaze never left her daughter. You took out a second mortgage, she said quietly. Delaney paused mid-scroll. It's temporary, she replied, with a practiced lightness. It's called leveraging assets, Mom. We talked about this. No, Caroline said. You talked. I listened. A beat passed between them, silent, taut. You forged my signature, Caroline continued. You changed legal documents. You moved my money into accounts I couldn't see. And then you laughed about it. Delaney's expression hardened. What are you even talking about? I heard the voicemail, Caroline said. You called me a dumb old credit card with a pulse. Delaney's mouth parted, then closed. She shifted, folding her arms. It was a joke, she said flatly. Jesus, you're taking everything so personally. Caroline leaned forward, eyes steady. I gave you everything, and you itemized it. The silence that followed was thick and irreversible. Delaney let out a breath, exasperated. You're being emotional. The words landed like a slap. Not new, not even surprising, but sharp in their familiarity. Delaney's voice was cool, detached, armed with the false sophistication of therapy lingo and business vernacular, emotional, irrational, reactive. I sacrificed so much for you, Delaney continued, voice rising slightly. I managed your care, your bills. I took on stress you don't even know about, Mom. You don't appreciate how much I've done, how much I've had to manage. You mean control, Caroline said softly. Delaney stood, pacing now. Control? You couldn't handle it anymore. I stepped in. That's what responsible people do. Caroline stood too, but slowly. Her posture was calm, but her voice carried weight now. You didn't step in. You took over, without permission, without conversation. You didn't ask. You just decided I no longer mattered enough to consult. Delaney scoffed. So this is about your pride? This is about my personhood. They faced each other across the table like opposing counsel in a trial neither one wanted, but both knew had to happen. Delaney's arms were crossed now, her stance defensive. I didn't do any of this to hurt you. I did it because it was necessary, because you don't understand how much harder life is now, how unforgiving the world is. I was trying to help, but God, it's like you want to be a victim. Caroline inhaled sharply, then smiled, something between pity and finality. You've wrapped abuse in the language of modernity. You disguised it as structure, responsibility, love. But it was always about control. Delaney's expression twisted, somewhere between disbelief and fury. That's not fair. Caroline nodded. No, it's not. Nothing about this has been fair. Neither of them spoke for a moment. A wind chime stirred faintly from outside. Delaney dropped her arms. So what now? You cut me off? Is that what you want? I don't want revenge, Delaney, Caroline said, her voice firm but exhausted. I want distance. I want silence. I want peace. You're leaving? I already have. Delaney's eyes widened slightly. Where? Caroline tilted her head. Somewhere you won't find me. I've moved my money. I've rewritten my will. I've withdrawn from every place you infiltrated. That's dramatic, Delaney snapped. No, Caroline replied. It's overdue. They stood in that gleaming room, two women bound by blood and now severed by clarity. Delaney opened her mouth to speak again, but Caroline lifted a hand softly. I'm not here to fix you or explain myself. I'm here to end this. Delaney's mouth closed, her jaw tensed, but she said nothing. Caroline stepped toward the door, her purse light on her shoulder, not just in weight, but in meaning. For once, she carried nothing that didn't belong to her. At the threshold, she paused. You always claimed you were making sacrifices, she said quietly. But real sacrifice isn't leverage. It's invisible, and it doesn't keep score. She left the house without slamming the door, her heels quiet against the concrete path. The night air was cool, brushing gently against her skin like the first breath after submersion. She got into her car, started the engine, and didn't look back. Caroline had come with nothing, no suitcase, no evidence, no final threats. She left with less than nothing, in some ways. No closure, no apology, no guarantee her daughter would ever understand what she'd done. But what she carried was peace. and it was enough. Caroline was gone by dawn. No notes, no farewells. Just a single voicemail left for Sherry, her voice calm but firm. "I'll be in touch when I'm ready. I need some space to be someone else for a while." Only Sherry knew her location. A quiet, tree-wrapped cabin just outside Waterford, Vermont. The kind of place with dirt roads, handwritten signs at the co-op, and evenings so silent you could hear the wind negotiating with the pine. She arrived under soft rain, her bags minimal but precise. The cabin belonged to a friend of Sherry's who'd left it vacant after a divorce. It smelled like old cedar and dust. The furniture was plain, mismatched, warm with use. Caroline stood in the entryway for a long moment, taking in the unfamiliar comfort. She didn't unpack immediately. Instead, she walked barefoot through every room, her hand brushing walls, bookshelves, chair backs, as though reacquainting herself with the concept of space that didn't surveil her. Space that didn't whisper records, balances, or guilt. That first week passed quietly. She kept her phone off, watched the fog rise over the hills each morning. She ate simple meals, took long walks in boots too big, wrapped in sweaters too soft. One morning, she sat in front of the fireplace and wrote 2 sentences in her burner journal. "I don't owe them understanding. I owe myself recovery." Then she closed the journal and didn't write again. Instead, she burned it. The fire hissed as the pages curled into black script. She fed the flames in silence, watching her own handwriting vanish line by line. Not out of shame, but out of readiness. The journal had served its purpose. It had made her visible to herself. It no longer needed to follow her. With it, she left behind Delaney's name, her number, even the entries of pain that once defined her days. She folded the paper with her daughter's contact information into a tight square and dropped it into the flames. She didn't watch it burn. She stood up and walked away. Weeks later, at the Saturday Farmers Market, she saw a sign for volunteers at a local community school, retired teachers needed for literacy support. She showed up the next Monday at 8:45 a.m., holding nothing but her library resume and a smile that didn't need to prove anything. The principal, a middle-aged man with an easy way about him, shook her hand like they were old friends. "You're here to help kids fall in love with books?" he asked. "No," Caroline said. "I'm here to help them fall in love with their voice." The room went quiet for a beat. Then he nodded. "We need that." Soon she was in a classroom 2 days a week, helping 8-year-olds sound out big words, walking 6th graders through poetry prompts, reading aloud to a room of restless 5th graders and making every word sing. The children didn't know who she'd been. They didn't ask why she was here. They just listened. Caroline found her rhythm in their laughter, their questions, their honest presence. Here, she was not anyone's mother, anyone's burden, anyone's property. She was simply Caroline. She cut her hair one quiet Wednesday, sat in a chair while the stylist snipped away the long silver waves that had followed her like a history. She left with a sharp, chin-length bob that felt light and unfamiliar. The next day, she bought a coat, emerald green, wool-lined. She didn't check the price twice. She didn't call anyone. She didn't explain. She buttoned it all the way up in the store mirror and smiled at the reflection, someone who didn't need permission. Caroline spoke to Sherry weekly. Always brief check-ins, good meals, warm fire, snow coming. Nothing about the past, nothing about Delaney. That chapter was closed. Not forgotten, but set down. Then, on a snow-wrapped morning in January, there was a knock at the door. It startled her. No one knocked out here. Caroline opened it cautiously and found Carter standing there, hatless, cheeks wind-burned, panic written across his entire face. "Caroline," he said breathlessly, his voice hoarse. I didn't know where else to go." She didn't speak, didn't invite him in. She simply waited. He rubbed his hands together. "It's Delaney. She's under IRS investigation. Fraud, accounts, misfilings. Your name came up. Caroline. They're saying she forged—" He stopped himself. "It's serious." Caroline looked at him the way someone regards an echo, familiar, faint, distant. He added, "I didn't know she'd done this. I swear, I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry." She finally spoke, voice quiet, clear. "You came here for me or for help?" "I came here because I didn't know where else. She's unraveling. She's scared." And I thought, maybe you. No, Caroline said. Carter looked up, startled. I'm not a backup plan, she continued, softly but with steel. I'm not a burden. I'm not a bank account. I'm what survived. Carter's mouth opened, closed. Silence stretched between them. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know, she replied. She stepped back from the doorway, not to invite him in, but to close the door gently between them. As it latched, she let out a long breath, not of exhaustion but of certainty. She stood in the quiet cabin, the fire still warm from her morning tea. The coat hung neatly by the door. Outside, the snow fell steadily, clean, uncomplicated. Caroline moved to the fireplace again and sat on the floor beside it, her fingers grazing the small stack of books she was reading to her students. One cover was bent, the title faded. She didn't pick up the phone. She didn't draft an email. She picked up a pen instead, opened a fresh notebook, and on the first page wrote, My name is Caroline Whitmore. I am not the version of me they kept. I am the one I chose. She capped the pen, closed the book, and finally smiled. Carter sat stiffly on the cabin's floral print couch, his fingers gripping the ceramic mug Caroline had offered him moments ago. Black coffee, untouched. Snow thudded lightly against the windows, the wind whistling just enough to remind them how far from everything they were. Caroline stood across from him, arms crossed, steady. Her face was impassive, not hard but clear. Nothing here was casual. She wore her new coat unbuttoned, the green a deliberate flash of self-determination. She did not ask Carter to explain himself. She waited for him to volunteer it. He did. She used your name, he said, voice strained. For at least 3 separate shelters, tax shelters, hidden accounts under your social security number. The IRS investigator said it stretches back 4 years. Caroline said nothing. She made it look like a legacy trust, he added, almost apologetically. You were listed as originator, then Delaney as executor. It's complicated. No, Caroline said coolly. It's theft. Carter winced. She kept it buried, compartmentalized. I didn't know the extent of it. She told me, she said it was just restructuring. I should have. He trailed off, ashamed. You believed her, Caroline said. I wanted to, Carter admitted. It made things easier. Caroline's gaze was stone. For whom? The wind gusted hard outside. Carter looked down, rubbing a hand over his face. I thought if I came here and explained, maybe. I don't know. You deserve to know. I've known, she said, her voice cutting through the room like cold steel. Carter looked up. I sent the documents 3 weeks ago, she continued. Notarized evidence, ledger trails, account screenshots. I reported her. I filed it myself with federal investigators. Carter blinked, stunned. I hired Howard for more than estate work, she added. He specializes in forensic financial documentation. Everything you just said, we had it months ago. Carter's mouth opened, then closed. Why didn't you say anything? Caroline stepped closer, her gaze narrowing. Because when I speak, people call it emotional, or dramatic, or impulsive. I've learned to act first, and explain, if necessary, after. Silence. Then, she doesn't know, does she? She will, Caroline said. I gave her enough space to tell the truth herself. She didn't. She turned, walking slowly to a nearby shelf. From it, she pulled a heavy black photo album, its spine cracked, pages stuffed with high-gloss wedding photos, Delaney in white silk, Carter smiling nervously beside her. Caroline held the book a moment, her hands oddly gentle. She walked it back to Carter and placed it beside his untouched mug. You'll need it more than I ever did, she said. He stared at it, not touching it. She's still my wife. And I was still her mother, Caroline said, until that meant less than what she could forge in my name. The words were not angry. They were precise, weighted, decisive. She turned again, her eyes flicking briefly to the window. Snow flurried steadily beyond the glass. Carter's breath sounded loud now, jagged. I don't know what happens next, he said. I do, she answered. He looked up. She will be charged, Caroline said. Maybe not right away, maybe not the full extent, but she'll be investigated. And that will unravel everything else she's hidden. She did this to herself. I simply refuse to let it remain unspoken. Carter sat back, deflated. I tried to help her. She didn't need help, Caroline said. She needed resistance. He didn't reply. A long silence followed, the kind that stretches like frost over glass, spreading quietly until the world changes shape beneath it. Caroline's mind drifted, unbidden, to a memory from years ago. Her 17-year-old self, standing in the small-town library just past closing time. Her father had refused to sign the application for her personal card, claimed books beyond school were a waste. Caroline had waited until the clerk looked away, then scribbled his name herself. Shaky, crooked, not quite right, but they never checked. She walked home that day with 3 novels tucked under her coat. Her first act of defiance, her first taste of autonomy forged in someone else's name. The irony didn't escape her now, that her daughter's crimes echoed the structure, if not the spirit, of that first rebellion. But Caroline's action had been born of hunger, for knowledge, for space, for identity. Delaney's came from hunger too, but for control. You know, she said quietly, still staring out the window, the difference between theft and survival is who's left standing when the truth arrives. Carter looked up. And what are you now? She turned, facing him fully. Her voice, when it came, was flat with resolve. I'm what survived. He nodded slowly, the weight of the words settling into him. He reached for the photo album, finally, fingers brushing the leather. He didn't open it, just held it in his lap, like something heavier than it looked. Do you hate her? He asked softly. No, Caroline said, but I don't protect her anymore. Carter's eyes welled slightly. He blinked hard, exhaling. I should go. Caroline nodded. She didn't follow him to the door. When the screen door clicked shut, she sat in the chair he'd just vacated. She picked up the mug, sipped once, then poured the rest down the kitchen sink. Outside, Carter's car pulled slowly away, tires crunching snow. Inside, Carolyn opened a fresh notebook and began writing again. The cabin was still, lit only by the soft amber of late afternoon. Caroline sat at the kitchen table, a stack of documents beside her, her pen poised above a personal check. The cabin's wood stove crackled in the background, filling the room with a warm hush. Outside, wind pushed against the pine, but inside everything was precise, calm, final. She wrote slowly, each stroke of ink deliberate. The amount, everything, her estate, liquid and resolved. The recipient, a nonprofit supporting survivors of domestic financial abuse. She had researched them quietly, days spent reading testimonials, studying programs, cross-referencing their grants with actual outreach. They offered emergency accounts, legal navigation, advocacy. They helped people like her, people whose names were used like currency, whose lives had been broken into by those closest to them. She had selected them not just because they helped, but because they believed survival was a start, not an end. In the memo line, Caroline wrote a single word: goodbye. She signed it, tore it from the checkbook with a soft rip, and let it flutter gently onto a stack of receipts from her recent bookstore donation drive. Some bore handwritten thanks from clerks in Waterford, little notes in the margins. For the kids' shelf, more poetry than we could afford. Tell the reader thank you. She smiled faintly, placing the check delicately on top. The contrast was poetic, money once weaponized, now repurposed. The closing of a story told through capital, beginning with erasure, ending in clarity. On the wall behind her sat a photo she hadn't taken down. Delaney, age 10, reading Island of the Blue Dolphins, face slack with wonder. Her daughter had once loved stories too, before calculation took the place of curiosity. Before control dressed itself in the language of care. Caroline's donation had been made in another name, Elise, Delaney's middle name. She wanted the story to be traced, not to Delaney, not to herself, but to what might have been. Howard had arranged everything, accounts liquidated, assets transferred, names removed, stories retained. He sat across from her now, final forms in a manila envelope, his glasses resting halfway down his nose. He looked at her with quiet admiration, and something else, respect laced with caution. He knew the cost of closure. I've submitted the archive, he said. All redacted but protected. You'll remain anonymous as discussed. Caroline nodded. She trusted him completely, not because he offered safety, but because he offered agency. Howard hesitated. The journalist may want to talk to you directly later. She can listen to the recordings, Caroline said. He tapped the folder once, then slid it into his briefcase. And what do you want now? She looked at him. Nothing I need permission for. That night, Caroline walked the check and receipts to the small post office just off Main Street. She mailed them with no ceremony, hands steady. On the way home, she stopped to watch the snowfall gather in lamplight. She didn't think about Delaney or Carter or what the papers might print. She thought about the first woman she saw speak up in one of the nonprofit's testimonial reels, her voice cracking as she said, "I didn't know who I was until I had something no one could take." Caroline had wanted nothing more than that her whole life, something no one could take. She found it in her silence once. Then she learned to find it in her voice. Weeks later, the story broke in a modest national outlet. Caroline's name wasn't mentioned, but the voice was unmistakable, clear, firm, slightly weathered, but unyielding. The recordings had been included in the federal case file. Caroline hadn't realized how powerful they sounded until she heard them read back. Her tone wasn't angry. It was factual. It had the gravity of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to define. "I was told I was a burden. I became the one who carried it all. I was never protected. I was only paused. I am not a line item. I am not a fallback. I am the truth that outlived her lie." The prosecutors used the recordings to establish both fraud and coercion, evidence of systematic manipulation, financial erasure, and willful misrepresentation. Delaney Whitmore Hayes was formally indicted on federal fraud and identity falsification charges. The press did what the press always does: dug up everything, reframed, debated, speculated. The trial would be long. It might go quiet again before it reached its conclusion. But Caroline wouldn't be there to watch. That chapter no longer belonged to her. She had not made the recordings for retribution. She had made them for the part of herself that once whispered thoughts into locked journals. The voice that had gone quiet for decades. The one she'd burned to give rise to another. She still woke early, still taught at the community school, still walked the dirt roads at dusk. Her students had started writing their own short stories, folding them into small books, dedicating them to characters of their own making. One child, a girl named Miri, had written, "To Miss Caroline, who reads like she's letting you live." On her birthday, she received a card from Sherry. Inside, one sentence, "You gave her back to herself." That's the legacy. Caroline left the card open on her desk, beside her green coat, beside a pair of winter boots she'd bought on sale with no one's approval but her own. The past had not disappeared, but it no longer dictated her. She was no longer a secret, no longer an inheritance. She was the one who decided what was passed on, and to whom. The recording opened with the faint hiss of background static. Then, a calm, measured voice. "My name isn't important, but for today, you can call me C.W. Caroline sat in a modest radio booth in Burlington, a fleece draped over her knees and headphones gently pressing her hair flat. She hadn't been nervous when she arrived. She felt the same cold clarity she'd known the day she signed away her estate, the same resolve that had anchored her as she burned the past. "I want to talk about money," she continued. "Not the kind you can spend, the kind that's used to hold people hostage, the kind that hides behind love and wears efficiency like armor." The interviewer said very little. Caroline had told them in advance. No probing, no interruptions. Just space. She'd written her own narrative. All they needed to do was let her read it aloud. "I spent 40 years believing that silence was a virtue," her voice said now, smooth, unwavering. "That if I kept the peace, I'd be loved. That if I made myself small enough, efficient enough, needed enough, I'd stay safe." Outside the booth, the radio engineer gave a thumbs up. Caroline nodded back faintly. "But there's no wealth in silence," she said. "Only rot." The line hung in the air. She hadn't planned it, but it felt true. It cut through the carefulness. It exposed the core. When the broadcast aired 3 days later, the station received more messages in one morning than they had all year. Listeners, mostly women, but not only, wrote in with words they hadn't said aloud in decades. A daughter whose inheritance was reassigned. A widow whose pension vanished under her son's name. A sister billed for loans she never took. CW became a rallying cry in message boards and quiet group chats. She said what I was never allowed to. "I am not a line item either. I am what survived." Sherry watched the movement take shape with tears in her eyes. Caroline had asked her not to speak publicly. Not yet. But she was under no such silence herself. So she did what she could. She organized. The first meeting of the Financial Survivors Circle was held in the back room of the Waterford Public Library, the one where Caroline used to read to third graders. 12 women attended. The next week, it was 24. By the end of the month, Sherry had filed paperwork for nonprofit status. They didn't begin with budgeting or debt repair. They began with naming, with truth-telling, with reassigning value. Caroline didn't attend the meetings in person, but she donated chairs. She sent annotated reading lists. She helped with transport grants. Quietly, she stayed present. The online forums swelled with people who recognized themselves in CW. The unseen, the appropriated, the silenced. The name grew beyond Caroline's story. It became shorthand for a collective pain finally given form. One evening, curled up with a cup of cinnamon tea and a small fleece blanket, Caroline reread the transcript of her broadcast. She circled the final paragraph. "I'm not telling this story for punishment. I'm telling it for record. Because value isn't what's taken from us. It's what we decide not to give away." That night, for the first time in weeks, she picked up her phone, not to scroll news, not to check balances. She clicked the old voicemail thread with Delaney. The thread was dusty now, unopened since Vermont's first snowfall. She hit record. Her voice, when it came, was bare. "Delaney," she said, "you won't hear from me again, but you'll hear of me." A pause. "I hope your daughter never feels the way I did." The recording ended. She didn't add anger, didn't need it. The sentence was final enough. She saved the message. She didn't hit send. Instead, she uploaded it to her archive. She'd named the folder Statements of Value. It contained everything she'd once buried: the old forged documents, the check images, the recordings, even scans of her burner journal's first pages. Each item was dated, labeled, not to be weaponized, but to remain visible. Proof that her life had occurred, not as memory, but as evidence. Later that week, a national newspaper published an investigative feature on financial abuse. CW was quoted throughout, her voice measured, unmistakable. "I forgave her," one pull quote read, "but I never forgot the way my name disappeared from my own life." A sidebar offered resources. One link led to the Financial Survivors Circle. Another led to the nonprofit in Elise's name. Caroline walked to the local coffee shop the day the article broke. No one recognized her, but someone at the table beside her was reading the story aloud, her voice shaking. "She's not a victim," the woman whispered to her friend. "She's a damn lighthouse." Caroline smiled into her cup. She didn't need thanks, or credit, or repair. She needed record. The world was changing, slowly, but it was. And when it asked who had helped it turn, there would be a voice, clear, firm, unmistakable, that reminded them, not all equity is measured in accounts, some of it is declared, out loud. At last, the snow had begun again. Light at first, just a sift of white across the wind, but growing thicker as the morning wore on. Caroline stood outside the small branch bank, the last one with her name on file. She'd arrived on foot, a single canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her boots damp from the walk. Inside the building, she had signed one last set of papers. Declined the printed receipt. She stepped out and paused at the threshold, fingers gripping the cool plastic of her final debit card. The air smelled like metal and ice. The street was quiet. She pulled out a small pair of scissors from her coat pocket, tiny ones, the kind meant for threading fabric, and without hesitation sliced the card cleanly in half. The pieces snapped with a soft crack and fluttered into her gloved palm. Just across the street ran a shallow river, half frozen, its surface glossed with patches of fragile ice. She walked to its edge, leaned over the low railing, and released both halves into the water. They drifted a few seconds, caught in a slow current, and then disappeared under a skin of slush. The wind rose, but Caroline didn't shiver. The act wasn't about money. It was about finality. A closing gesture for a ledger that had once contained her name in everyone's handwriting, but her own. She turned away, pulled her scarf tighter, and walked back toward the heart of town. By afternoon, she was inside the Waterford Community Center, warming her hands around a mug of mint tea. The writing workshop had just begun. The room was quiet, except for the scratching of pens, the rustling of composition notebooks. A handful of young women and a few teenage boys sat scattered around folding tables, heads bent in concentration. Caroline moved gently among them, offering soft praise, a few nudges, her presence calm but assured. She no longer taught formally, but this weekly workshop had become her favorite hour. No grades, no rubrics, just voice, ink, and the courage to say something out loud. The girl in the far corner, 16, maybe 17, lifted her hand. "Can I read?" she asked. Caroline nodded, stepping aside to give her space. The room hushed. The girl stood, cheeks flushed. She opened her notebook, fingers trembling slightly. "It's short," she said. "All good stories are," Caroline replied. The girl began. "When my mother says I'm too much, I remember the ocean doesn't apologize for drowning islands. I am not made to be convenient. I am made to be real." A pause. Then the room erupted softly into snaps and claps. Caroline smiled, not just at the girl, but at what bloomed in the air: ownership, defiance, clarity, not the kind forged by grief, the kind shaped by choice. Behind her, above the whiteboard, a small framed quote hung slightly crooked on the wall. It read, "Value is not currency, it's clarity." Caroline had written it on a napkin months ago. One of the volunteers had turned it into art and nailed it into place. She sat at her desk as the students continued writing. She didn't monitor them. They didn't need monitoring. What they needed was the freedom to think out loud without punishment. What she had needed all those years ago. Later that evening, as the last student left and the lights dimmed, Caroline gathered her coat, slung her bag over her shoulder, and stepped back into the snow. The flakes were heavier now, brushing against her cheeks like whispers. Her breath made soft clouds as she walked. She passed the same bank on her way home. The lights inside were dimmed, the glass doors locked. Her reflection hovered faintly in the window. Older, yes, lined, yes, but grounded, undiminished. She paused only a second before moving on. Her feet knew the way home. Inside her apartment, the heater buzzed faintly. She removed her boots, her coat, the scarf. She placed her bag on the hook by the door. It was lighter than it had been for years. She moved to the small desk by the window and opened a new notebook, clean, unlined. She wrote only one line on the first page. "She called me a burden, so I became something she couldn't carry." She closed the notebook. No name on the cover, no need. She knew who she was now, and that would be enough. If this story struck a nerve, it's because it lives in more homes than headlines. Share it with someone who's been told to be quiet, compliant, or convenient. Start the conversation that was never safe to have, because silence protects no one, and stories like Caroline's are just the beginning.